So I think without any further ado, we'll jump right into the next set of papers, starting with Peter Fenves's Singularity Again. Oh, Peter, I think you're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to be reading this from my screen, which is the only way I can do it. I'm really honored to be participating in this colloquium in honor of Professor Weber's work. And I call him Professor Weber for a reason here, which I'll explain in a moment. Okay. When I first saw this talk would be placed at the beginning of the colloquium devoted to Singularity's philosophy, I actually put away the notes I had written up and decided to say something instead about beginnings and the philosophy of or by singularity, and which itself, of course, related to the problem of beginnings, indeed, the beginning of philosophy. But first, a minor beginning, which is the reason I am speaking of Professor Weber in this context. My first seminar as a graduate student, as it happened, was one taught by Professor Weber, and it was about singularity, specifically the singularity of aesthetic judgment. I had come to the university in question, which I won't name, to study with Professor Weber, and was eagerly anticipating the seminar after I discovered the required books, which were Kant's Critique of Judgment in German and English, and Derrida's La Vérité en peinture, without any translation, of course. And I can simply say that upon entering the windowless seminar room, very unfriendly room, packed with people, overpacked with people, my anticipation was no help, so to speak, for the educational experience that I encountered, which was unlike anything else I'd ever seen, which was namely Professor Weber working, reading, developing thought before my very eyes, without notes, but always directly respondent to the text or to the questions that were being posed. And as for the thoughts that were being developed in this seminar, they revolved around, for me, the altogether new concept of singularity, which was said to be distinct from universality and particularity under the rubric of quantity, somehow connected to the category of totality. And I understood very little, yet by virtue of the intensity of the engagement with the text and with the questions, they sent me to reading much of Kant's works, as much as I could accomplish in a semester, and always borne along by Derrida's questions, which, as it were, they enlarged the frame by virtue of its microscopic analysis, which were then telescoped in Sam's proceedings. At this point, I'll speak of him as Sam. This was the singular most influential seminar I ever experienced. And for better or worse, this was probably, there's not a single thing that I've done as a scholar that does not involve a return to this seminar with Kant and Derrida mediated always by Sam. I don't think this is a unique experience, however. I think that many of those who have shown up here, many of the people here, and not only here in this colloquium, have a similar experience that actually, I think, helps with its singularity. Ever since Sam's elucidation of the paradox associated with the singularity of aesthetic judgment in Kant, framed by Derrida's analysis, I've been eagerly awaiting Sam's book on singularity. Did he mention something about a book along these lines in the seminar? I don't actually remember the words, but I seem to remember that a book of this kind was promised, even if he didn't quite state it as such. Which means, in practical terms, for a very long time, I've been collecting Sam's papers associated with the concept of singularity. Not only these, but especially these, which are under a file with this name, now in my computer, a digitalized file. It didn't begin in this way. And this brings me to a bigger question, a bigger beginning. Indeed, the biggest, a big bang, to use an associated expression, which involves a singularity. And in traditional terms, it's the question of creatio ex nihilo. It's a little odd to be switching to Latin at this point, but we might discuss that. For Sam's inquiry into singularity and its philosophy, often, as I see it, seeks to demonstrate or suggest the following mutual repugnance: singularity and creation, when the latter is understood as ex nihilo, even only implicitly as in the attribution of creativity to individual geniuses of whatever stripe. For example, and I should add that I'm not certain this is the best example, a recent essay published in L'Atelier, the workshop, which happens to be in my digital dossier. So in Singularity, Individuality, and the Delimitation of Life, Sam writes the following, quote, "The notion of a singular universal supreme being pre-existing the articulated world, which is then conceived as his creation, informs a conception of identity, subjective and object, in which A equals A, in which the first person singular is construed as homogeneous and self-identical. Above all, this first and supreme being is held to stand above and beyond the limitations of space and time, which is to say the limitations of bodily existence. Such a supreme being provides the basis for constructing, for construing a world, which is then conceived as his creation, serves as a paradigm for the notion of identity, subjective and objective. And this is decisive because it indicates what I take to be the motivating force that has given this legend its durability, which above all stands above and beyond the limitations of space and time, which is to say the limitations of bodily existence." So there's much too much in this series of compact formulations to discuss in a limited amount of time. So I'll only attend to the phrase, redolent of Kantian thought, which is elsewhere seen in the essay, limitations of space and time. What are these limitations? And how does it stand with space and time such that the "and" is commutative? That is, there's no difference between space and time and space. The singularity problem outside of philosophy that I mentioned before, although this is probably not outside of philosophy, involves something other than space-time, namely space-time, more exactly the collapse of a reduction of the two in a singularity. Here, though, in this reflection, bodily existence in its singularity is spatially and temporally limited, whereas the agent of creatio ex nihilo, hence the creator, is not supposed to be so. And this supposition here, called a long-standing legend, itself a term that should attract attention in the context of Sam's earlier work, this legendary supposition generates the hypothesis that guides the inquiry specifically, and this is Sam's question, I'm going to be quoting it. What are the forces that lead to such a notion of a universal, pre-existent creator God, and above all, that gives it its power to persist over centuries? In response to this question, Sam continues, I offer the following working hypothesis. Such a notion is required if one desires or feels constrained to think of life as essentially a process that exists independently of death. With infinite amounts of digital space, but time running out, I want to begin this limited reflection on Singularity's philosophy with a Kantian-inflected counter-question, which is this. Are the forces under consideration, those that lead to a notion of a creator God, also not at work, as it were, in the putative universality and particularity of space and time, of space with time and time with space, each universal elements of so-called life particularized in each life, in each singular life? If the singularity of life is bound by space and time, absolutely bound so, such that there is no life that's not delimited by space and time, this compromises or contaminates its singularity, which always already conjures a counter life, sometimes called eternal, sometimes immortal, sometimes only long-lasting and semi-spatial. One form of this counter-life is the universal creator God, but this is only one, delimited by others, always perhaps in conflict with others, such that it makes no sense on its own and understands itself in this way, as do the other such gods, or non-spatial temporal things, always in conflict with each other. I'm going to conclude by emphasizing this is an example of the seminar question that places me in particular still situated in the same space and time, me alone, but probably not really alone, in that seminar in 1982, as I was listening to Sam talk about the singularity beginning with the singularity of aesthetic experience. And with that, I'm going to conclude.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. Yes, and remember, please formulate some questions, and we will have time at the end for questions for all four of our speakers for this panel. The next speaker is Astrid Deuber-Mankowsky, and she is going to speak about the ever new angel.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank James and Julia and Peter and Jörg, who cannot be here. And for sure, I'm very, very happy to be here and to be part of this event. And I just want to use my 10 minutes. So the title you have already mentioned is The Ever New Angel. Originally, this title of this short birthday greeting should have been different. Had I spoken German, I would have started my presentation with the following quotation from Goethe's 1790 Faust, a fragment. Und wenn es uns glückt und wenn es sich schickt, so sind es Gedanken. Why I do not translate it into English? The answer to this question leads me to Sam's unique way of thinking in, with, and between languages, different languages. Sam pointed this quote out to me when we discussed the topic Glück by Walter Benjamin in a workshop at the University of Bochum in autumn 2005. Sam presented an outstanding close reading of Benjamin's early and only posthumously published texts Schicksal und Charakter and Das Glück des antiken Menschen. With Hölderlin, Benjamin states there that die Glücklichen, the lucky ones, have no fate. They are schicksalslos. As we try to understand this difficult passage, Sam quoted the lines from Goethe's Faust, und wenn es uns glückt und wenn es sich schickt, so sind es Gedanken. And he added that Lacan used this same quote as an epigraph to his famous essay, Seminar on the Poleined Letter, also in German and not translated. So we learned that Glück in Benjamin or in life is connected with thinking, and that thinking, on the other hand, is not entirely in our hands, that it must glücken, succeed. I had not been aware of this connection between the German noun Glück and the verb glücken, which constitutes the association between Glück and thinking. And what exactly does it have to do with Benjamin's assertion that the Glücklichen are schicksalslos, that they have no fate? Lacan has also to understand this. Whoever succeeds in forming thoughts is without fate insofar as they succeed in escaping the compulsion of repetition, as they succeed in affirming change and mutability. Sam helped us recognize the track which leads from the German Glück and Glücken to Denken. And he did it exactly because this connection exists neither in the English word happiness nor in the English word luck. And he insisted on it through all these years. That's why the title of this short intervention is The Ever New Angel, der immer wieder neue Engel. It relates to Benjamin, and I try to show in the following that Benjamin actually connects thinking with Glück in a very subtle way. You spin the magic ring for free. I don't have any sense. This is the second last little known line of the poem Greeting from the Angel by Gershom Scholem, whose fifth verse is so much more familiar to us. My wing is ready for flight, I gladly returned, for I also remained living time, I would have little luck, Glück. These 4 lines are in contrast to the rest of the poem, so well known because they introduce the famous 9th thesis of Benjamin's on the concept of history. By quoting the poem, Benjamin refers to the correspondence on angels and angelology that he had conducted with his friend in Switzerland 20 years before the theses were written. In his letter to Gretel Adorno in May 1940, Benjamin mentions that he had kept those thoughts which he wrote down under the impression of the war, and that during this period had kept them safe from himself. Benjamin combined the description of the notes with the announcement that he would have handed them over to her. I quote Benjamin now in my translation, so I hope. More than a bunch of whispering grasses collected on thoughtful walks than a collection of theses. He never took them to the post office. He handed them over to Hannah Arendt on the run in Marseille, who brought them to the US. Scholem had sent the sonnet Gruß vom Engel, Greetings from the Angel, in July 1921 for Benjamin's 29th birthday. The angel in whose name Scholem wrote was Paul Klee's Angelus Novus. Benjamin, one of the first collectors of clay, acquired the Angelus Novus during a visit to Scholem in April 1921 in Munich. Since he had no permanent residence at that time, he left the painting to his friend for safekeeping so that it hung in Scholem's room in Munich from April to November, while Benjamin was in Heidelberg and traveling. The greetings from Angelus was meant as a playful greeting from the angel in the painting that was in Scholem's room. At the same time, however, the poem was formulated as a self-description of a transitory angel belonging to that flock who, according to Talmudic and Kabbalistic angelology, were only there to sing the hymns before God or praise before God, and as Scholem quotes from Otzor Hakabot, a mystical commentary on the Haggadah by Todros ben Abulafia, disappear like the spark on coal. It was this Talmudic motive of the coming into being and passing away of angels before God that, according to Scholem's testimony, interested Benjamin. In fact, in the 2 versions of the short 1933 note, Angesilau Santander, a mediation on his life, departing from Klee's Angelus Novus, Benjamin related the new angel to the Kabbalistic angelology quoted by Scholem. For Benjamin, the Angelus Novus was not a once and for all new angel, but rather an ever new angel. One of the new angels created in an instant in myriads and just as quickly passed away again. The Kabbalah, Benjamin summarizes, the Kabbalistic angelology tells that God creates in an instant an innumerable number of new angels, each of whom is only destined before they melt into nothingness to sing for a moment the praise of the Lord before his throne. Yet, as Sam, in his reading of this short note, rightly pointed at, Benjamin's new angel did not disappear. Benjamin's new angel, who emerges, this is Sam now, out of the old names to sing the praises of the Lord for a brief instant, is interrupted, prevented from fulfilling his destiny, but also from disappearing. And Sam concludes, the angel that survives as interrupted image, however, differs from the traditional notion of angels insofar as its image displays no resemblance to the human form and figure created, as the Bible says, in the image of God. In the second version of Angesilaus Santander, however, which is dated only 1 day later than the first one, the scene of the Angelus Novus combines the rhythm of the ever-recurring, the innumerable one more time, with the temporal index of the nu, which for Benjamin is actually the time experience of Glück, the time of intensity and fulfillment. The Angelus Novus wants, as Benjamin writes there, das Glück. The Angelus Novus wants, as Benjamin describes in a formulation that he associated only a few years earlier with the childlike experience of play and sexuality. And now I quote Benjamin, the Angelus Novus wants the conflict in which lies the ecstasy of the unique, the new, the still unlived, with that bliss of the once again, of the have it again, of the already lived. The angel, therefore, as Benjamin continues his speculation, has no other way to hope for anything new than when, on the way home, that means into the future of which he is the messenger, he takes with him a new human. Scholem emphasized the difference between Benjamin's connection of the Angelus Novus with Glück and the one in his poem. He wrote, I quote now Scholem, "Das Glück of which my poem spoke was certainly related to the success of his mission, from which he expected little. With Benjamin, however, that Glück, as the angel wants it, has a completely new meaning." I think Scholem is really right on this point. And I would like to conclude this short reflection on Glückdenken and the ever new angel with a quote from Sam's reading of the first version of Angesilaus Santander. I quote Sam now. "The new angel glances at us and yet past us. And thus looking past the past or the past, such a glance perhaps leaves room for a different kind of future, one that would not lead back simply to the place from where we have come. For if this text and Benjamin's writing in general suggest anything, it is that such a place can never be found because it never stays where it was." And I just wanted to end with one word, namely zum Glück, fortunately. Yes, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Astrid. Our next speaker is my co-host, Julia Eng, who will give a talk called Whistling Lillabullero. Julia, take it away.
Hi, thanks. First of all, thank you everybody for being here and accepting our invitation at such haste. Also, thanks to Arlette for keeping it a secret from Sam until literally the last minute. I hope Sam was pleasantly surprised. It's wonderful receiving Sam's extremely surprised email that morning. Thank you also to Peter stepping for Jörg, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and Courtney for helping or sort of the organizational aspects of this. So in the spirit of the occasion, I wanted to begin my remarks with a personal recollection. So Sam, as some of you know, has had the burden of knowing me since I was pretty much a teenager, which means that he has had to field all sorts of requests from me for a very long time. Requests that he always obliges with a characteristic abundance of generosity, as anyone who knows him will attest. One of my earliest memories of Sam, in fact, has to do with one of those moments when I cornered him for advice. We were hanging out after some pre-graduation event on the rooftop of what was probably Royce Hall at UCLA. I was about to depart the US for Hong Kong and wasn't sure what lay ahead of me. We somehow got into talking about our shared interests in music and opera in general in particular. I mentioned that once in secondary school, I was really annoyed that I was never let on stage because as the only pianist in my year, I was always stuck providing the musical accompaniment from behind the scenes, most memorably for a production of Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore.
When do you have to leave? Nicholas?
Upon mention of which, as I recall, both Sam and I spontaneously started whistling the tune of the operetta's main theme. As tempted as I am, I won't start whistling the tune right now, and I don't recall exactly what else was said in that conversation, but the memory of this moment later became the reason why I found the nerve to stay in touch with Sam, who then tried valiantly to get me a placement at the Stuttgarter Staatsoper, where he himself had interned as a dramaturge many years before. Eventually, on his recommendation, I ended up at Northwestern, where Sam continued to share with me, as with all others, his wisdom, more so now in the form of drafts and pre-production versions of his talks and eventual book chapters. I revisit these texts from time to time. They are, as it were, the musical accompaniment that has become company of an altogether different sort. Indeed, they have, through the years, been an accompaniment to the thinking and writing that, without it, might never get done. And it was in preparation for today that I revisited some of these drafts, one of which Sam had sent me for a seminar he gave at my behest at Goldsmiths on the singularity of literary cognition. In one of them, which is devoted to Kafka's story, Josefina the Songstress, or the People of Mice, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before, previously. The discussion of Josefina circles around the particularly ambiguous nature of her pfeifen, or whistling, as the sound emitted by someone who, described as a singer, whom one might expect to sing instead, the whistling upsets expectations. But moreover, the whistling is not even peculiar to her, but rather to all the mice people, who, against all expectations again, are nevertheless moved by it despite its unexceptional character. One might in turn expect the mice people to grant Josefina the exemption she seems to ardently demand, Sam says, but instead we arrive at another turn. The mice firmly refuse her demand. No expectation is met with anything but its contrary, which is ultimately also echoed in the conjunctive disjunction of the or in the title Kafka gives to his story, Josefina or the story otherwise known as The Mice People, either Josefina or the Mice People. Frustrating the demand to interpret me, the or in the title reflects the extremely ambivalent relationship that binds Josefina to the Mice People, the songstress to the Mäusevolk. Each of them, as Sam points out, is convinced that they protect the other, but not a single one of which, according to the narrator, is convinced by what the other can accomplish over the other. Specifically, Josefina is said to whistle at the very notion that the collective has a power greater than that of the singular individual. Thus, Sam writes, if the content of Josefina's imagined response challenges the conventional wisdom that privileges the collective, the people, as more powerful and protective over the singular individuals who compose it, the form in which it is articulated is even more challenging to establish conventions of representational discourse. But what does it mean to whistle? The published version of Sam's text proceeds to discuss the problem posed to conventional accounts of sociability by Josefina's performance as an assembly point for a temporary collective composed of vulnerable and separated bodies. Looking through an earlier version of the chapter Sam had sent me, though, I was struck by the insertion of the following comment. Quote, I am reminded of Uncle Toby in Sterne's Tristram Shandy, who, whenever anything unpleasant arises in the Shandy household, which is often enough, responds by whistling Lillabullero, a march dating from the English Civil War. Frustrating conventional divisions between voice, speech, and discourse, Josefina's fricative whistling exposes the conventions of sociability as situationally relative and unable to fully erase their alternatives. In what way might the unerased comment on whistling Lillabullero invite us to take another look at Sam's thinking on the situational and the social? In the first instance, I was immediately reminded of something Sam had been telling me all along, and which is certainly no secret, especially ever since he gave an interview on the occasion of the Freie Universität Berlin's anniversary celebrations. Tristram Shandy, Sam says in that interview, has accompanied him throughout his life. The accompaniment of the novel's overarching importance can also be seen in connection with one of his most memorable writings on theatricality, namely his reading of the off-scene appearance of the ghost in Hamlet 1:1, where Marcellus and Horatio try in vain to pin down the exact location of the specter, followed by 1:5, where the ghost admonishes Hamlet from beneath the floorboards to swear, again, as it were, in what Sam calls an anti-performative undoing of the executive authority of oath-taking altogether. In a preliminary version to this chapter, Ibe e Ubique, Sam prefaces his discussion with this reminder, quote, "It is always dangerous, and especially so when dealing with literary texts, to draw general conclusions. For such generalizations are difficult to evaluate and have the tendency of taking on a life of their own. The critic then risks resembling Walter Shandy, Tristram's father, who was always ready to sacrifice everything in the world, and indeed the world itself, on the altar of his favorite hypothesis, with the consequences that the reader of Tristram Shandy comes to experience on almost every page." It is in contrast to Walter Shandy that another Walter, namely Walter Benjamin, demonstrates the necessary open-endedness of reading and revision, leading into the discussion of the necessity of ghosts to appear and take place in a place that is inherently unstable, and where the ghost, which as Horatio says, will not stand, is the very essence of that which is difficult to pin down. As it turns out, though, Walter Shandy's readiness to sacrifice all on the altar of the hypothesis is also the occasion of one, if not the first mention, of Toby's predilection for whistling Lillabullero. For in the face of Walter Shandy's never-ending philosophizing, quote, "My uncle Toby would never offer to answer this by any other argument than that of whistling half a dozen bars of Lillabullero. You must know it was the usual channel through which his passions got vent, and when anything shocked or surprised him, but especially when anything which he deemed very absurd was offered." In this unerased comment, it is Toby's whistling Lillabullero that exposes the situational relativity of discursive conventions and meets attempts to pin things down once and for all with the absurd. But what is the meaning of this whistling? The tune itself is from an anti-papist ballad that originated in Ireland around 1687 as a rallying cry against James II and Richard Talbot, his Roman Catholic Lord Deputy, whose appointment was feared to have dire consequences for the Protestant community. Wildly popular with the English regiments, the tune was on occasion even described by contemporaries to have Lillabuillero'd James II and Popery out of the kingdom during the so-called Glorious Revolution. In Tristram Shandy, Uncle Toby whistles Lillabullero whenever he apparently does not want to provide an answer, prompting Tristram, the narrator, to baptize it the Argumentum Fistulatorium, which roughly translates as argument by whistling. This impression is reinforced in Book 9, Chapter 17, whose mention of Toby's whistling is, as a side note, followed in some apocryphal 19th century editions by the actual score. Otherwise, it is succeeded by two blank chapters, 18 and 19, in the duration of which we are led to surmise that Uncle Toby and his sidekick, Corporal Trim, go into the house of the widow Wadman to finally show her once and for all where he was wounded, while we, the readers, are apparently left lurking just outside the door. What follows is the well-known and, dare I say, much beloved episode in which Uncle Toby endeavors, with the help of a map, to help Widow Wadman put a finger on where he was wounded at the Battle of Namur. Much to Widow Wadman's consternation, of course, whose own designs to discover whether Toby would satisfy her requirements as a future father and sexual partner are, of course, foiled, seemingly, by the ambiguity of the word where. But is it just so? We can more closely examine the nature of this modesty. The Widow Wadman declines out of modesty to further pursue the question of where Toby received his wound. By conventional logic, the collapse of the courtship between Toby and Mrs. Wadman ensues from the impossibility, viz. Incapacity, of Toby to resolve this ambiguity in an unambiguous manner. But in the prefatory chapters to this episode, Toby begins, as it were, whistling already a couple doors down in chapter 16, where in a demonstration of a different kind of modesty altogether, Uncle Toby seems to show a momentary faint-heartedness and tries in vain to stop Corporal Trim in time from knocking on the door and announcing their presence. Whereupon, quote, perceiving all hopes were knocked on the head, Toby whistled Lillabullero. This brings me back to the first mention of Toby's whistling and Tristram's offer of an explanation of what occasions it. Walter Shandy was in the habit of aggravating Toby by retelling the story of Aunt Dinah's affair with a coachman. Toby, being, quote, a gentleman of unparalleled modesty, could never bear to hear the affair, but with the greatest emotion, which, as usual, was channeled into whistling back rather than offering up a counter-argument. The character of this modesty, however, is described by Tristram as being a woman's, by which he means, as he details, he got it from, quote, a blow from a stone, broke off by a ball from the parapet of a hornwork at the siege of Namur, which struck full upon my uncle Toby's groin. Coming full circle, in a circular logic that Tristram also demurs in this instance to elaborate, leaving the discussion only to a promise to one day lay out every circumstance relating to it in its proper place, dislodging the place even of the modesty that we were led to attribute to an incapacity for disambiguation. In place of modesty, then, the possibility of coyness. In place of ambiguity, the ambiguity of an ambiguity, where ambiguity touches itself. To bring this back to the beginning, when Sam provides the accompaniment to your thinking, the attunement to the force of this ambiguity also shares the ground of ambiguity with another attitude, one that derives from exposure and absurdity, an ungrounding of conventions of sociability and situational emplacement. And this, as I've had the privilege of knowing now for a very long time, unsettles the settled for the sake of the ungrounded, the sideshow, and the behind the scenes. Thanks, and happy birthday.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Thank you, Julia. And our final speaker for this session, Singularity's Philosophy, will be Laura Chiesa, whose paper is titled Remind Me Because I Often Forget.
Thank you very much, Julia. James and Jorge, who is not here, for organizing this really incredible at this time in which we are. So let me start. When I received the invitation, can you hear me? When I received the invitation to this joyful, yes, unexpected gathering in the middle of the semester, as I was trying to organize myself to finally end the separation from my partner in Paris that had been imposed by travel restrictions since January, I began to take notes, and I named the document A Start for Sam. My plan for the title was and is Remind Me Because I Always Forget, or often forget, something that Sam often tells me. Having had the incomparable opportunity to be part of Sam's seminar during, I would say, Professor Weber, a seminar during my graduate years, my mind started to run through the impressive constellation of readings and lecture to which I was exposed then, from Professor Weber, unheard reading of the Benjamin Trauerspiel to the comments on the not yet published English version of the Arcade Project, translated by Kevin McLaughlin, who would come to the seminar talking about paper and literature, while Derrida had just published Papier Machine. Derrida gave to Weber, Professor Weber, is not yet published Voyou, on which we commented not to mention reading chapter from the forthcoming, at that time, Theatricality as medium, as well as Benjamin abilities. My memory began to run high speed through notions such as ability, iterability, mass mediaureas, theatricality, repetition, and uncanny. And indeed, perhaps to arrest this chain, I asked myself, does the notion of memory or remembering play any role in Weber text? I already knew the answer, but I went back to 2 interviews in which memories in the plural appear. In Screen Memories, I learned about Sam's first stay in Berlin, but memory appears there only as negative. I lack concrete memory. I don't have concrete memories. However, in the interview with Peggy Camus, Double Features, Sam tells Peggy something about himself that relates to the Freudian notion of screen memories. He tells her, and I quote, anyhow, I myself suffer a great deal from this sense of screen memory for the simple reason that it tends to screen out what I feel I was really going on that time. It was really going, yes, but what remains elusive beyond my grasp. To some extent, every memory is inevitably and structurally a screen memory in this sense, EI, in the sense of being finite, but in my case, the screening out seems particularly extreme, end of quote. Well, he's saying something to dig into, but I move on to other readings, daring now to pitch on some moment in which Weber refers to remembering. In the introduction to the legend of Freud, Weber referred to remembering when articulating his reading of Freud's discovery of the unconscious and its relation to the space of dream. And I quote, "The eye that remembers, like the eye of the dreamer, finds itself scattered throughout the dream despite its apparent distance from it." It is in this way that Weber points at theatricality, at the theatrical, uncanny staging in Freud writings, and that is why I plunge into reading Psychoanalysis and Theatricality, a chapter of theatricality as medium. Hence, my attention was extremely disrupted this month by just the fact of traveling again, as if it were the first time, by arriving at my partner's apartment in Paris, but leaving after only a few minutes, as she was going to be tested for COVID-19. She tested positive, so I moved out once into an empty apartment close by while waiting some days for a second, more reliable test result, which was negative, while in the meantime, my mother and father in Italy tested positive for COVID. Everyone seems now doing fine, but I have passed through a period of extreme instability, as all of us are or have been, in a way or another. Let me go back to Psychoanalysis and Theatricality, in which Weber compares what is peculiar to the medium of theater to the way Freud approaches how the unconscious defines itself, and in so doing, it shows how Freud's approach results in a challenge to a stable conception of theater. How? Through a reading of Aristotle's Poetics, Weber demonstrates that to the core of the conception of theater, intended as a representation of a complete and meaningful action with beginning, middle, and end, the theatrical dimension is secondary. Therefore, Weber underlines a constitutive split of the theatrical mimesis because of the staging of the plot, which Aristotle nevertheless wants to represent for the audience as a unifying and meaningful action. Exploring the Greek term pratontes, which Aristotle employs to designate the theatrical mimesis representation on the stage, Weber suggests that the term refers to actant or acting more than the individuality of actors. Hence, acting refers both to the character represented on the stage and to the actor representing them. In theatrical acting, actors and role need one another. In Freud's definition of the unconscious in the interpretation of dreams, Weber discovered a theatrical conception of the psyche. Upon the dream's bit of content sensely piled up, the waking consciousness imposes a coherent and complete narrative through the secondary revision. It is not, we could say, or I read, an operation of a storyteller. Hence, exactly because, and I quote, the person remembering and retelling the dream is in a different position, even if the same, the psyche has become a kind of stage, an arena, a divided side where conflict forces place themselves out. The ego has now become as much a listener as a viewer, as much a receiver of messages as a teller of tales. And this involves not just a shift from sight to sound, but even more significant, a fundamentally different relationship to itself and to others. End of this long quote. Remind me, because I often forget, is what Sam tells me when we meet, as we may have mentioned readings, events, or papers he has recently written that I'm eager to read. Among these figures, anxiety, the uncanny borderline of psychoanalysis, in which Weber returns to the psyche as a stage of force field of conflict. The notion of a border traversing this force field of conflict dislocates the interiority of psychoanalysis as well as of the psyche, which Weber underlines is not in Freud defined as subject or as self. Indeed, it is for this reason that instead of the technical terms, ego, id, and superego, Weber preferred the more colloquial translation, I, it, and over I. Through a reading of specific passages from the dependency of the I, Weber argues that, and I quote, the linkage of anxiety to the I, coming either from the external reality or from it or over it, is the internal borderline that divides psychoanalysis from itself. Traversing several of Freud's texts, Weber indicates that anxiety was a constant concern for Freud, as it challenged the internal coherence of the psychoanalytic discourse. Was it a loss of control of the I or a tentative attempt to take back control? Was it disrupted of the unity of the psyche or instead a defense, a signal as an anticipation? In the dependencies of the I, Weber goes after a specific relation between the I and the over I in the recognition of loss as it relates to fear of death. And he quotes part from the end of this last chapter. The I gives itself up because it feels itself hated and persecuted by the over I, or a little bit later, it gives itself up. Just as in other cases of anxiety, it gives up to another object. In this case, the I gives itself up, seeking to save an ideal notion of the self. Hence, in the uncanny, Weber indicates a turning point a turning point for the theory of anxiety. If the uncanny is a form of anxiety that appears strange while revealing itself as familiar, it implies a split in the notion of cognition, maintaining itself in the ambivalence of the knowable and unknowable. This brings alteration, for the conception of the I turns out to be heterogeneous, differential, and just to grasp another bit of the essay, maintaining the split alters its significance. It is here that Weber turns our attention to telling, retelling, and storytelling, and to the tallik, a term himself introduced in The Legend of Freud while studying Freud's analysis of jokes. The joke process is one in which the expectation of language, if I understand correctly, are not fully meaningful per se. The Shaggy Dog story is tallik for being a more, Sam Wright, feminine network with significance relies on telling and storytelling. Weber affirmed this as he reads from Freud, and I quote from the quote from Freud, "These jokes are not entirely unintentious. They are Shaggy Dog story and give the teller a certain pleasure by misleading and annoying the listener. The latter then mutes this annoyance by resolving to become a storyteller himself." End of quote. In the short yet very intense ending of the essay, Weber compared this quote to Walter Benjamin's Storyteller, whose telling story implies that those who listen retell them differently. The close of the essay is not intended to efface the border between the space of the session and the open space of social and historical tradition. If the relation, to come back to the dependency of the I to the over I is maintained, it leaves room for others to take its place. If those who listen to the storyteller search out advice for a specific reason, Weber reminds us that the search has its relation also to the great other, death. But the storyteller's sole answer is to tell another story that the diverse I will retell. Weber's penultimate line is, "The hope is that you will continue," hence, in parentheses, to be continued, hence they say without ending it. How is this relation between Benjamin and Freud, not to make generality, in relation to the storyteller in Weber writing, to be continued? I'm looking forward to hearing or receiving them in my mail.
Thank you so much, Laura. Okay, so we have about just about 10 minutes for questions. And I think since the little hand thing doesn't seem to be happening, you can either write in the chat, "I would like to ask a question," or I think it's safe to just talk. So I open the floor. While I'm waiting for other people to formulate their questions, I have one for Julia. Julia, I loved your talk so much, and I was just really interested in how whistling can express things that words cannot. And I was sort of wondering in particular, just to bring this really back to Sam's work, if you think that somehow whistling sort of expresses the singularity of communications better than words, or just in a very different way.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on what it means, what you mean by communicate, and what's supposed to be communicated in the act of whistling. I guess there's a couple things. First of all, all these comments didn't make it to the final edits, right? So I sort of like dug out all these sort of surreptitious like accompaniments to Sam's own thinking that happen to be indebted maybe to this whistling issue. And I guess the question is like, what if anything, what's the whatness of being communicated in that instance where we're talking about a language of accompaniment to which even the language of debt doesn't really do the full justice to it, right? It's the it opens up, if you will, maybe another setting, another kind of another type of sharing of space, if you will, that doesn't hew to notions of what gets expressed versus what doesn't, but somehow in a kind of circularity perhaps, or a host of other types of space-time configurations in respect to this, one arrives at then a different notion of how to think, say, as I was saying, sociability, things that depend on communication, like sociability, notions of like situational emplacement, without the need for thinking about grounds for communication, even in the whatness of what is supposed to be communicated.
Great, good, very good answer. Other questions for anyone on the panel, for any of our four panelists?
Okay, I'm going to ask a question, if I may. To Peter Fenves, you mentioned briefly the connection between Sam's notion of singularity, or his usage of, or his references to Kant's third critique and the singularity of aesthetic experience. You connected it briefly to the idea of singularity in physics as the sort of conflation of space and time. And I'm just curious about whether you think there is actually an analogy in the usage of singularity in both realms.
I'm going to respond by anticipating that Sam might have something to say about this in our final session. We've had some discussion about it, which is why I referred to it mostly in passing. And unfortunately, some of the opportunities that we had to discuss this question were missed, or I missed them. But my simple answer to that is, of course, first of all, the fact that the word is used means that there has to be a connection. And I'm wondering to the extent that whether Sam's forthcoming book will address the singularity issue. So could I, that's my response. It's I'm going to pass that on to Sam and would be interested in reflecting on it here, then, or at a follow-up colloquium around the publication of the book. Sam?
If I can, yeah, well, if I can just, I always feel a little nervous when, but also compelled to deal with such issues when I have such a shaky and external relationship to mathematical and scientific theory. But I certainly try to, I mean, if you Google singularity, you'll come up with references to Ray Kurzweil and black holes and singular events and so on. And I do try to address it, and but it's a little bit like what I was speaking with Hans-Jörg, what I was discussing with Hans-Jörg in the pause and so on. that I tend to, I'm afraid that I may function on a more conventional understanding of how these terms are used, but I try to, I try to see the problem as see it epistemically within science as problematizing certain traditional notions of knowledge, and and in a simple way, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, for example, kicks in. But as far as I understand it, in at least certain scientific practices, there is an attempt to use this as a way of making more precise measurements. Whereas it seems to me that singularity in literature opens out onto the question of the incommensurable and the unmeasurable. But this may be, so I do certainly discuss this in the initial chapters of the book, which I hope will be out in the spring. But I'm very eager to hear how people like Hans-Jörg and others who and you Peter and might find that or something. I am trying to so it has to do with the question of measure, for example. What is measurable and what is not? So, for example, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle tries to deal in some way with not exactly the problem of singularity, but in other words, the criterion seems to be ever more exact measurements, ever more precise measurements, at least in one. Now, what Hans-Jörg is arguing for in terms of experimenting, by taking it back to the Aristotelian thaumaison, the astonishment, and emphasizing the differential character, might go in a different direction. So in a certain sense, when we're dealing with what's called science, I'm not sure that we're dealing with an absolutely uniform or monolithic practice. We're dealing with a number of different, as the same thing with in literary studies and elsewhere, so that you have for example, institutionalized criteria for the allocation of social resources may be determined by a certain understanding of science, and at the same time you have researchers who are emphasizing another dimension to it, and so on. It's a little bit like the old opposition that Thomas Kuhn, introduced between normal science and I forget what he called the alternative paradigm changes and so on there. Yeah.
Okay. Hans-Jörg, did you have a question?
No, I just adding a sentence because I think Sam, you're completely right that singularity, if it comes to mathematics, takes on another meaning. And I am not very familiar with that myself. But for instance, in physics, the Big Bang, or you could also take evolutionary processes where you have points of singularity, where things can either move in one or the other direction. And that is, to my understanding, that is very much connected to the notion of event. And I think that might be a notion that would combine the different realms.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because that's a point that I also make in the book. But that there's a shift in language, for example, from particle, let's say, to event, that I think is related here to this change in the structure of scientific knowledge under the impact of the notions of singularity.
So we're officially out of time, but I thought maybe we could have a question or two more, just to cut into our half-hour break a tiny bit, if anyone else has any, because I don't want to cut anything off. I actually had a question for Astrid, which I will ask, because I loved your paper, Astrid. I really liked when you were talking about how unlike the other angels, the new angel sticks around. And I guess the point is that the angel sticks around for us. And then thinking of that in terms of singularity, I was wondering if in a way like Prometheus, the new angel sort of suffers to become singular for our behalf. And if in that case, ends up so singular that he ends up on a painting in Walter Benjamin's kitchen. Do you know what I mean? It really localizes. I don't know what you thought about that.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I just thought a lot about it, and I was very happy then to read Sam's interpretation and his absolutely exactly way of reading, because he would say that the angel, I would have tended to read the myriads of new angels which were recreated every moment as one angel, you know, as a kind of an event. But then Sam would say to me in his text, I mean, he came up and would say, but wait, Astrid, wait, Benjamin's angel did not disappear. So he did not disappear in the flock of all angels. You have to be very exactly and to have to look what happens to the angel in terms of mediality, because he is there he is there and he is not there, but he's there in the picture, he is there in the imagination. And this, I think, was very helpful for me to come back to another kind of experience, namely the experience of rhythm. And this rhythm of, you know, returning and but not in a way which would make it impossible to have the experience of an event, in terms of perhaps they might happen something different or something new. I don't know.
Great.
Yes, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, we are now past the time when we were supposed to stop. I was hoping we could maybe, if any of you have questions, maybe for Laura too, maybe you can put them into the next session so that we can take a little bit of a break. But so I want to sort of, once again, we will return at 11:45 Chicago time.